November 1941. Outside Moscow. Temperature is minus 35 degrees Celsius. The men of Army Group Center are dying. Not in the way soldiers die in battle, quickly, from bullets or shrapnel or the sudden violence of an artillery round. They are dying slowly. From cold. From frostbite that turns fingers black and then removes them. From pneumonia that fills lungs with fluid in men whose immune systems have been destroyed by 4 months of continuous combat without adequate rest or supply. The engines of the tanks will not start. The oil has thickened to the consistency of tar. The breech mechanisms of the rifles freeze shut. A man who removes his gloves to operate his weapon risks losing his fingers to the metal. The medical supplies are frozen solid. The food is frozen. The water is frozen. The Wehrmacht, the most powerful land army in the history of warfare, the force that had destroyed Poland in 5 weeks and France in 6 and Yugoslavia in 11 days, is dying in the snow outside Moscow because it was sent to fight a Russian winter without winter equipment. Not because the winter was unexpected. Because one man in a headquarters in East Prussia had decided, in the summer of 1941, that the war would be over before the winter came. He was wrong. 1,000 miles away, in the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler is looking at a map. The map shows Army Group Center's positions. The positions are close to Moscow. Closer than any German forces have ever been. Close enough that German officers with binoculars claim to have seen the spires of the Kremlin on clear days. Close is not the same as there. And the men who are close are dying. To understand what happened outside Moscow in the winter of 1941, you have to understand what Army Group Center was and what it had done in the preceding 5 months. Operation Barbarossa had begun on June 22, 1941, along a front that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains. 3 million German soldiers, supported by 3,000 tanks and 2,000 aircraft, had crossed the Soviet border in the largest military operation in the history of warfare. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was the strongest of the 3 army groups that had crossed the border that morning. It held 2 panzer groups, Guderian's 2nd and Hoth's 3rd, and 2 field armies, the 4th and the 9th, and it was aimed directly at Moscow. In the first weeks of the campaign, Army Group Center performed at a level that military historians have struggled to fully describe. The encirclement battles at Minsk and Smolensk were executed with a speed and coordination that had no precedent in the history of land warfare. At Minsk, within the first 10 days, Army Group Center encircled and destroyed Soviet forces numbering over 300,000 men. At Smolensk in July and August, a further 300,000 Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured. The numbers were staggering. The German intelligence services, attempting to assess the impact of these losses on Soviet military capacity, concluded repeatedly through the summer of 1941 that the Red Army had been broken. Each assessment was wrong. Each time the Red Army had been declared incapable of sustained resistance, it produced more divisions, more tanks, more men, from a reserve that German intelligence had consistently underestimated. But the encirclements were real. The prisoners were real. The equipment captured and destroyed was real. Army Group Center was advancing, and the men who commanded it believed, on the basis of what they had achieved in the preceding months, that Moscow could be taken before the winter. The argument about whether to drive directly on Moscow or to wheel south toward Kiev occupied the German High Command through August 1941. Hitler ordered the wheel south. Guderian's panzer group was redirected toward Ukraine. The Kiev encirclement that followed was the largest single encirclement in military history, capturing over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. It was a genuine operational triumph. It also consumed 6 weeks that Army Group Center could not afford. Operation Typhoon, the final German drive on Moscow, began on October 2, 1941. The conditions were not the conditions of June. The summer had ended. The autumn rains had begun. The Russian roads, which were in most cases dirt tracks rather than paved surfaces, had dissolved into mud. The mud was a specific Russian phenomenon that the Germans called Schlammzeit, the mud season, and it was worse than anything the Wehrmacht had encountered in the campaigns of Western Europe. Vehicles sank to their axles. Tracked vehicles that could continue moving did so at a fraction of their normal speed. Supply columns that should have covered 30 miles a day covered 3. And then the mud froze. The freezing of the mud in October and November 1941 solved one problem and created another. The frozen ground allowed vehicles to move again. The frozen temperature began killing men. Army Group Center did not have winter equipment. The decision not to issue winter equipment had been made in the summer, on the basis of the assessment that the campaign would be concluded before winter arrived. The Quartermaster General's office had winter equipment in storage in Germany. It had not been shipped forward because shipping it forward would have consumed rail capacity that was being used for ammunition and fuel and spare parts for the summer campaign. The summer campaign was not concluded. The winter arrived. The soldiers at the front were wearing their summer uniforms with whatever improvisation they could manage. Newspaper stuffed inside clothing. Straw wrapped around boots. Rags tied over hands. None of it was sufficient against temperatures that fell to -35 and lower. The German military medicine records from November and December 1941 document frostbite casualties at rates that exceeded combat casualties in some units. Men were losing feet and hands and ears to cold while still technically in their positions, still technically a fighting force. The offensive toward Moscow continued into November because the commanders at every level from Hitler down to Army Group believed that Moscow was within reach and that taking it would end the campaign. The belief was not irrational. Moscow was the communications hub of the Soviet railway system. Its capture would disrupt Soviet logistics in ways that the continued Soviet resistance depended on. It was the symbolic capital of the Soviet state. Its fall, the German command believed, would break Soviet morale in ways that Stalin's own propaganda acknowledged it could not survive. General Heinz Guderian, commanding the 2nd Panzer Army in the southern portion of Army Group Center sector, was the officer who understood most clearly what was happening to his forces and was most willing to say it plainly. Guderian was one of the creators of modern armored warfare. He had written the book literally on tank tactics in the 1930s, a book called Achtung Panzer that had shaped not only German armor doctrine but the armor doctrine of armies around the world. He had commanded the panzer thrust through the Ardennes in 1940 that had broken the French front, driving so fast that his own high command had ordered him to stop because they could not believe his columns had actually reached the positions he was reporting. In November 1941, Guderian was watching his army die in the snow and writing reports about it that his superiors found uncomfortable. He reported that his tank strength had fallen to 30% of establishment. He reported that frostbite casualties exceeded 10,000 men in a single week. He reported that the supply situation made continued offensive operations unsustainable. He requested authorization to halt the advance, consolidate his positions, and wait for the spring. His reports were received at Army Group Center headquarters and at OKH, the Army High Command, with responses that ranged from impatience to fury. The offensive would continue. The army would advance. Moscow would be taken before the winter made operations impossible. Moscow was not taken. The closest German forces came to Moscow was approximately 15 kilometers from the city's outer suburbs, in the first days of December 1941. Soldiers of the 258th Infantry Division reported being able to see the towers of Moscow through field glasses. They were the westernmost point of the German advance on the Eastern Front in the entire war. They were also at the end of their strength. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive began. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the Western Front defending Moscow, had been preparing the counteroffensive through November while the German offensive was still continuing. He had been receiving fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East, transferred west after Soviet intelligence had determined, from the spy Richard Sorg in Tokyo, that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union in the east. The Siberian divisions were winter-equipped, winter-trained, and composed of men who had grown up in conditions colder than the Russian winter outside Moscow. They attacked along a front of 900 kilometers. The German forces that received the attack were, in the words of the unit diaries and officer reports from the period, at the limit of human endurance. Men who had been fighting continuously since June 22, who had not had adequate food or sleep or warmth for weeks, who were suffering from frostbite and dysentery and the accumulated physiological damage of 5 months of the most intense land warfare in history, were hit by fresh Soviet divisions attacking with a ferocity that the German command had not anticipated. The German line bent. In some sectors it broke. The requests from front commanders to Hitler for authorization to conduct a fighting withdrawal to more defensible positions began arriving at the Wolf's Lair on December 6. The requests used the careful language of the German military tradition, which expressed operational necessity in terms that were designed to be heard as professional assessment rather than failure. The message behind the careful language was not careful. It was urgent. The line could not hold where it stood. Had to move back. Hitler refused. His order, issued on December 16, 1941, was unambiguous. There would be no voluntary withdrawals. Every position would be held. Commanders who ordered withdrawals without explicit authorization from Hitler's headquarters would be court-martialed. The line would stand where it stood. The generals who had been requesting withdrawal understood what the order meant. It meant that men who could not hold their positions because they were frostbitten and exhausted and outnumbered by fresh Soviet divisions would be required to hold them anyway, or to die in them. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the German army, who had been attempting to mediate between Hitler's hold order and the operational reality facing Army Group Center, suffered a heart attack on December 19. He resigned. Hitler took direct command of the German army himself. He was now the commander-in-chief. The generals who argued with him were arguing with their supreme commander. General Erich Hoepner commanded the 4th Panzer Group, which was part of Army Group Center. When the Soviet counteroffensive struck his positions, Hoepner made a decision that the military situation required and that Hitler's order had explicitly prohibited. He authorized a withdrawal of several miles to more defensible terrain. Hitler relieved him of command. He was dismissed from the German army, stripped of his rank and pension, and forbidden from wearing his uniform. The dismissal was public and was intended to be understood as a warning to every other commander on the Eastern Front about what happened to generals who ordered unauthorized withdrawals. General Hans-Gunther von Kluge, commanding the 4th Army, argued with Hitler about the hold order in a series of communications through December and January. Von Kluge was not a man given to defiance of authority. He was a professional soldier who believed in discipline and the chain of command. He also believed, on the basis of what he could see in front of him, that the hold order was killing his army. He did not get shot. He was replaced. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, the commanding general of Army Group Center, who had led the Army Group through its summer triumphs and autumn advances and winter catastrophe, was relieved in December 1941 on the official grounds of illness. He was ill. He was also a general who had been arguing, with increasing desperation, that his army group needed to withdraw to survive. Guderian's relief came in late December. He had flown to Hitler's headquarters to argue personally for a withdrawal authorization and for the issuing of winter equipment. The meeting was, by Guderian's later account, a conversation between two men who were not communicating. Hitler told him that the soldiers at the front must hold their positions. Guderian told Hitler what the soldiers at the front actually looked like. Hitler told him that willpower could overcome physical conditions. Guderian was relieved of command on December 26, 1941. He was replaced by General Richard Ruoff, who had not argued with Hitler about the hold order. The hold order worked, in the sense that Army Group Center did not collapse. The German line bent enormously in the weeks following the Soviet counteroffensive, giving back territory that had been purchased at enormous cost in the summer and autumn, but it did not break completely. The Soviet counteroffensive, which Zhukov had planned as a drive to encircle and destroy Army Group Center in its entirety, fell short of that objective. The German soldiers who held their positions in -35 temperatures without winter equipment, sustained by the momentum of refusal that Hitler's order had imposed, prevented the Soviet exploitation from becoming the complete destruction of the German position in the east. This is the fact that Hitler used for the rest of the war to justify the hold order. The line had held. His generals had wanted to retreat. He had refused. The line had held. The conclusion he drew was that his instinct had been vindicated and his generals had been wrong. The conclusion was wrong in the way that conclusions from single cases are often wrong. The line had held at enormous cost. Cost in men, cost in equipment, cost in the accumulated exhaustion of forces that had now been fighting continuously for 7 months. The hold order had prevented a collapse. It had also prevented the kind of elastic defense that might have preserved the Wehrmacht's offensive capability for 1942. The men who held in December 1941 held at the price of being destroyed as an offensive instrument. The German losses on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1941 to 1942 are difficult to state precisely because the German record-keeping from that period is incomplete, and because the definition of casualties varied by context. The most careful historical estimates put the German losses from frostbite alone in the winter of 1941 to 1942 at over 100,000 men who required medical evacuation and treatment. Combat casualties for the same period added several 100,000 more. The frostbite casualties were, from a military planning perspective, the most damaging in the long term. A man who loses fingers to frostbite cannot operate a rifle. A man who loses feet to frostbite cannot march. The frostbite casualties of December 1941 and January 1942 removed from the Eastern Front a substantial number of trained and experienced soldiers who would not return to combat. They were replaced by men who had not been through the summer and autumn campaigns, who had not developed the specific expertise of Eastern Front survival, who were learning what their predecessors had learned at the same cost. The winter equipment finally arrived in early 1942. White camouflage smocks, insulated boots, felt overboots that fit over standard military footwear, items that had been sitting in warehouses in Germany since the autumn, waiting for a war that was supposed to have ended before they were needed. They arrived too late for the men who had lost their fingers and their feet in December. Guderian spent the rest of the winter and spring of 1942 in Germany without a command. He was recalled to service in February 1943, after the Stalingrad catastrophe, to rebuild the German armored forces. He served as Inspector General of Armored Troops, a position that gave him authority over training and doctrine but not over operational decisions. He used it to argue for concentrated armored employment and against the dispersal of armor in defensive roles that the strategic situation increasingly demanded. He argued with Hitler throughout 1943 and 1944. He was right most of the time. He was overruled most of the time. He survived the war. He wrote his memoirs in the late 1940s and early 1950s, a book called Panzer Leader that is one of the most important primary accounts of the German war on the Eastern Front. He was careful in the memoirs to be accurate about what had happened while being diplomatic about some of the conclusions that the accuracy pointed toward. He died in 1954. Hoepner, who had been dismissed and stripped of his rank for the unauthorized withdrawal in December 1941, was later implicated in the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler. He was arrested, tried before the People's Court under the judge Roland Freisler, and hanged on August 8, 1944. He was 57 years old. The men who died in the snow outside Moscow in December 1941 and January 1942 are recorded in the casualty lists of their units, and in the records of the German military cemeteries that were eventually established in Russia and Belarus after the war. The German War Graves Commission, which has been working since the end of the war to locate, identify, and properly inter the remains of German soldiers who died on the Eastern Front, has recovered and reburied hundreds of thousands of men from the fields and forests where they fell. The work is not finished. The Eastern Front was enormous, and the records from its worst periods are incomplete. Men who died in December 1941 in positions that were subsequently overrun and then recaptured and then overrun again were buried and unburied and lost in ways that make identification difficult or impossible. The German War Graves Commission estimates that approximately half of the German soldiers who died on the Eastern Front have been properly accounted for. The other half are still in the ground. Outside Moscow, in the forests west of the city where the closest German advance stalled in December 1941, the ground is quiet now. Birch forests have grown up through the positions where the lines were held. The foxholes have filled in. The equipment that was abandoned when the lines finally did move has been removed by collectors and scrap dealers and the slow processes of decomposition. The towers of Moscow that the soldiers of the 258th Infantry Division saw through their field glasses in December 1941 are still there. Moscow is a city of 12 million people. The distance between the city center and the position where those soldiers stood is covered now by suburbs and ring roads and the ordinary infrastructure of a major modern city. The soldiers who stood there are not. They held their positions because they were ordered to. They died in them because the alternative was court-martial. They prevented a collapse that the military situation had made plausible, and in preventing it they were destroyed as the offensive instrument that had made the advance possible. Hitler concluded that his instinct had been right and his generals had been wrong. The generals he dismissed concluded otherwise. The men in the snow had no conclusion to draw. They were in the snow. They were cold. They were waiting for orders. The orders said hold. They held.